Everyone, I'm Greg Salmieri for the Salem Center here at the University of Texas, Austin. This event on the why there's an individual right to abortion is co-sponsored by the Objectivism program at the Salem Center and by the new Ayn Rand Club at the University of Texas. And I'm very pleased that it's an important issue, a very serious issue around the world, in America in particular, and especially here in Texas. And I'm very pleased to introduce as our speaker Ben Bayer. Dr. Bayer is a fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute. He was formerly a professor of philosophy at Loyola of New Orleans, among other places. He's written and spoken widely on a number of topics, including abortion, and is the author of the recent book, Why the Right to Abortion is Sacrosanct, which there are some copies of for attendees who don't have it yet and would like it. Complimentary copies. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bayer.
Thanks, Greg. So I could start my talk today by talking about a story like that of the 10-year-old rape victim in Ohio, you probably heard of, who had to escape to Indiana to get an abortion because the Ohio heartbeat abortion ban permitted no exceptions for rape. I could even talk about someone you might have heard of in the news just last week, Amanda Zarofsky. She and some colleagues of hers filed a lawsuit against the state of Texas because of the following thing that happened to her. She was something like 17 weeks pregnant, discovered she had a condition that was going to mean the fetus was simply not going to survive birth. But because the Texas law said you can't have an abortion if it still has a heartbeat, she couldn't end it. And as a result, had to wait until her blood was infected with poison. She went septic, which is a potentially life-threatening condition. That it was only then that the doctors allowed her to have an abortion because they were so intimidated by the current Texas law. I could talk about cases like that, cases where a woman's life is in immediate danger or some other kind of emergency situation like a rape case. I could talk about those sorts of cases, which I think are very important to talk about, but I'm not actually going to talk about those kinds of cases today. And the reason I'm not is because I actually think that those sorts of cases are not what the abortion debate in America is really about. And that's because what abortion rights are about, and what they're for, is protecting women's ability to pursue their paths in life, their chosen paths in life, their ordinary life goals. And just to give you a flavor for what I'm talking about, I want to share with you what I think is a more typical case. This is the story of Emily. Emily was a 21-year-old college junior. She'd been in a relationship with a man for maybe a year and a half. She said she was hopelessly in love with him at the time. However, she hadn't yet gotten to the point of realizing how manipulative he could be. And when an unplanned pregnancy occurred, it occurred to her, well, you know, if I kept this baby and had this child, I could conceivably bring us closer together. But on reflection, she realized, no, this guy is manipulative, and I don't want to have a child with a man like him. And so she decided to have the abortion. And this is what she said about her decision. She said, yeah, I probably could have made do and had an okay life if I had chosen to continue my pregnancy. But I didn't want to. She had the abortion. She ended the pregnancy. She also ended the relationship. She then found somebody who loved her as much as she loved him. They're now married and planning to have children. The important thing to underscore about cases like Emily's is that most abortions are like hers. That is, most happen because the woman decides that having a child would change her life dramatically, would interfere with her career, with her education. The Guttmacher Institute, which studies abortion statistics in detail, figured out that something like 74% of abortions happen for this kind of reason, which is to say, they happen because women decide they don't just want to live an okay life. They want to live an extraordinary life. And it's not just that that a high percentage of abortions are like this. There are more abortions happening than you probably realize. Guttmacher also estimates that something like 19% of pregnancies end with abortion, and that is not counting miscarriages. That's intentional abortions. That's 1 in 5. What that means is there are probably people you know, there are probably women you know who've had an abortion. Now, you might not know who they are, but they're out there. I've had at least 5 women tell me that they've had abortions. The reason, of course, that you probably don't know about them is because most of them happen so early in a pregnancy that you wouldn't even know the woman was pregnant in the first place. The CDC in 2020 estimated that 93 of abortions happen 13 weeks or earlier in pregnancy. As of 2022, we figured out that almost half of all the abortions that occur happen by medication, like through mifepristone. You can only prescribe that abortion drug for 10 weeks or earlier into the pregnancy. And so that means a huge chunk of the abortions that happen are happening 10 weeks before, when it's not even a fetus, when it's an embryo. Even though abortion critics like to talk about late-term abortions, the CDC estimates that less than 1% of abortions happen after 21 weeks. And yet, even though the vast majority of these abortions happen before 13 weeks, many of them even before 10 weeks, there are now 12 states in the Union, including, of course, Texas, in which abortion is banned from conception. That means a huge number of women, including many you might know, are now not going to be able to get these very early term abortions. Ones where you would not have even known they were pregnant. It could even get worse than that, because there's currently a case in federal district court up in Amarillo, Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine versus FDA, which is asking for an injunction from a federal judge to ban the abortion pill. Not just in Texas, not just in that district, but nationwide, including in the states where abortion is legal. That could be a huge impact on a lot of people you know, a lot of women you know. And think about what that impact actually means. It means that, let's say, even if a woman discovers as early as 10 days that she's pregnant, that's about as early as you could ever figure it out, she couldn't terminate the pregnancy. And that's when what we're talking about is a primitive blastocyst, which is at most 300 cells, 0.2 millimeters in diameter. That's the kind of thing that she is not even allowed to touch or to terminate. That's the kind of entity that is said to have a right to life, competing with her right to choose her path in life, to choose to pursue her happiness. So what I'm going to do in this talk, as you can tell, I guess, from the introduction and from the title, is to argue that, especially in cases like this, a woman has an absolute individual right to abortion, not just for the sake of getting out of emergency circumstances, but for the sake of the pursuit of her own happiness. I think that the idea of forcing a woman to submit her chosen path in life for the sake of this embryo that's blastocyst, that's 0.2 millimeters in diameter. That's morally perverse. Now, I think there's honest and rational disagreement that you can have about late-stage abortions. I have a view on that, but that's not what I'm going to talk about today. Because before you can even begin to have an argument on a subject like that, you need to get clear on the simpler cases. The case that should be simple, I think, the case like one of these 93% of abortions that happen before 13 weeks. That should be simple, but for some people at least, it's not. I'm going to argue that this absolute individual right exists, even though a number of things that abortion critics sometimes say are true. You can defend an absolute individual right to abortion even if the right to choose doesn't mean the right to violate other people's rights, even if the embryo and the fetus are of the species Homo sapiens, even if abortion is sometimes immoral. All of these things can be true, and still there can be an absolute right to abortion. And if you don't see that, my hypothesis is it's because there's a confusion about what it is to say someone has a right to do something. There's a confusion about the nature of the concept of individual rights. So to defend my case, I'm going to do basically 2 or 3 things in this talk, 3 if we have time. The first thing is say more about the nature of individual rights. Elaborate on that really crucial concept to show what it means and hence how it works in practice. This is something I think most people who debate about abortion on both sides of the issue don't do. They take a kind of snapshot understanding of the idea of rights, and then they very quickly apply it to debates about the nature of the fetus. I don't think you're going to know what you're looking for if you're looking for the rights of the fetus, if you don't know what rights actually are. Then I'm going to apply this concept to the abortion case. I'm going to argue that if you take very seriously the idea of individual rights, and by that I mean the Enlightenment, original American founding concept of individual rights, the idea of the rights to the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, you'll see this concept simply just does not apply to a being like that 0.2 millimeter diameter embryo. And you may think this sounds a bit strange because, doesn't the Declaration of Independence talk about the right to life? Well, here's again why it's so important to get clear on, well, what do we mean exactly by rights and what kind of life are they supposed to protect? If I have time, the third thing I'll do then is talk about why people can't see this, what I think are some sources of confusion on this topic. One last note before I get into my first big topic, which is nature of rights, and that's that this is a philosophic argument that I'm going to be giving. I'm not going to be making an argument about legal issues. The Supreme Court has spoken in the Dobbs v. Jackson decision. They have declared that they think there's no right to abortion that's protected by the Constitution. As it happens, I disagree with them even on the legal issues, but it's also kind of a moot point. We're not going to see a major change at the court on this anytime soon. And so if we want to make progress in defending women's abortion rights, we need to go to a different level. We need to go to a philosophical level, to the level that can begin to influence other sources of law, state laws, state legislation, state debates about state constitutions, changing state constitutions, and yes, perhaps even federal law. So I'm going to be arguing for what I think a constitution should protect, whether or not our current federal constitution does. Okay, so like I suggest, I think a lot of the confusion on this topic comes from confusion about the nature of individual rights. Individual rights is a concept in political philosophy. Political philosophy is the subject that studies how shall we structure our society. Should we have a theocracy or a secular state? Should we have a monarchy or a republic? Should we have a democracy or a limited government? The idea that government exists to protect individual rights is a view that helps answer each and every one of those questions. And it does so by doing, I think, two basic things. It identifies a certain view of nature of the good life, the virtuous life that's worth achieving. And then it says something about, well, how does living in a society bear on that? What kind of society do we need to have if we are to achieve our particular philosophical conception of the good life? And the philosophy of individual rights has a very particular view on each of those. To bring out what that view is, I want to give two major kinds of examples. Now, there's more I could give, and if you're interested, you can ask me for more. But I've said that I think that the philosophy of individual rights is a distinctively Enlightenment era concept. It's the idea that's expressed for the first time most consistently by John Locke, which is later implemented in the American Constitution, the American constitutional system. So I'll give some examples of how I see this operating in the original American system, for instance. So consider just, for example, Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, which of course is famously the one that says we have rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, why is it invoking rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Well, it's the Declaration of Independence. It's invoking them to justify a violent revolution against Great Britain for the sake of political independence. Why? Well, because Jefferson and the founders allege that the king and parliament have imposed various restrictions on the liberties of Americans, and that they think these liberties will be better protected if they have political independence. What kind of restrictions are we talking about? Well, there are many listed in the Declaration. But I'll pick a few, because I think they have a certain theme to them. Among the many abuses and usurpations Jefferson mentions as having been committed by the king, he mentions raising the conditions of new appropriation of lands, sending out swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance, cutting off our trade with all parts of the world. And of course, the most famous one that he mentions, you probably remember this one, taxation without representation. There's a certain view of the good here, of the good life that Jefferson sees the king as interfering with. It's a life that consists of industry and commerce and peaceful trade between peoples, between individuals, as opposed to a life of plunder, like he thinks the king is engaging in. So there's a certain view of what the good life looks like, and a certain view of what it looks like to interfere with that view and that life. So that's Jefferson. But let's also mention, not forget to mention, another important document of that period, the Bill of Rights, Madison's Bill of Rights. It's, of course, the First Amendment that most famously enshrines what I would consider to be just paradigm cases of individual rights. Rights to freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion. These two are there to protect a certain positive value, something seen as morally admirable. A value that's of great value to the Enlightenment thinkers, the value of enlightenment, that is, value of the value of knowledge of the world around us, which the Enlightenment thinks if you're able to get that value, you need to be able to explore different ideas, experiment with them, debate with other people, disagree with other people. You may even need to disagree with the entire majority of a society. The rights you see enshrined in the Bill of Rights, especially in the First Amendment, are there to protect, more than anything else, our ability to disagree with each other, the ability to dissociate with the rest of society. Madison, after all, in Federalist Number 10, is concerned with the power of factions. He knows that a tyrannical majority can violate individual liberties in just as much and just as great way as a tyrannical king. And so the rights that he identifies in the bill protect against censorship, they protect against the breaking up of meetings, they protect against burning of heretics at the stake. So again, you have a certain view of the good, the value of enlightenment, of knowledge of the world, and a certain view of how people interfere with it. Censorship, burning of heretics, religious repression. One important thing that comes out of this survey, of these two examples of individual rights of the Enlightenment period, is that a right in this conception is not simply what philosophers would call a corollary of a duty. Sometimes philosophers will say, if you have a duty not to murder people, then someone else has the right not to be killed. But the basic concept there is the duty. There's the duty not to kill, and then whoever has a life to take, they have a right not to be murdered. The individual rights concept from the Enlightenment is much more robust than that. A right is not simply a shadow of a prescription against someone's vice. It's a protection for something that's seen as morally virtuous. It's a protection of an individual's virtuous, dare I say, righteous, positive activity. The activity of commerce, the activity of knowledge pursuit, the activity of the pursuit of happiness. The way that the philosopher Ayn Rand summarized this Enlightenment American individualist conception of rights was to say a right is a moral principle defining and sanctioning a man's freedom of action in a social context. Sanctioning is important there. It comes from the same root as sanctify. She elaborated on this and said something surprising for someone who also supports abortion rights, which is that she thought the right to life was fundamental to all the other rights. But what did she mean by life? Well, here's how she elaborated. She said, life is a process of self-sustaining, self-generated action. The right to life, so therefore, means the right to engage in self-sustaining and self-generated action, which means the freedom to take all the actions required by the nature of a rational being for the support, the furtherance, and the enjoyment of his own life. Such is the meaning of the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So here it's pretty important that for her, the life that's protected by the right to life, human life, the life of the human individual, is not just the life of some cellular metabolism of some cells that happen to have human DNA. And it's not just the possession of a heartbeat. It's the pursuit, the active physical and intellectual pursuit of values out there in the world. So I think that overall view of what individual rights really are, what they're for, how they apply, I hope you already see, has some pretty direct implications for how we think about the abortion debate. And indeed, Rand was an ardent defender of abortion rights. You can read more about her position and the reasons she gave for it, which I'm trying to myself present here today. You can read more about it in that book, of which there are copies in the back. I think there's two major implications that come out of this worldview of individual rights. The first I've stressed, which is that individual rights are important because they protect morally praiseworthy, admirable activity. Think about that when you hear certain critics of abortion talking about what they call abortions of convenience. And this is what they call the ordinary abortions that I started talking about at the beginning. Abortions like the one that Emily has. As though an unwanted pregnancy is in the same category as missing towels in a hotel room. That's absurd. An unwanted pregnancy is not just an inconvenience. Ending an unwanted pregnancy is not just avoiding an inconvenience. It's making a choice about your future, about your pursuit of your vision of happiness in the one and only life that you get. Now, other people might disagree with your conception of happiness or disagree that you're enacting the proper means to that end. But like we discussed, what individual rights are for is precisely for protecting your ability to disagree, to go your separate way from someone else. If the woman is right that she needs an abortion for her happiness, well, then she needs to be able to get the abortion. But even if she's wrong, she still needs to be the one to figure that out for herself. You can't force her to be happy, to become virtuous, by forcing her to have that baby. It just doesn't work. So this is all further to the point that the right to abortion is not just about avoiding emergencies. It's about achieving something positive. This is the point that Emily was trying to educate us about when she said, I could have the okay life, I didn't want to. If you think back to the American Revolution, they were protesting British taxes. You know, they probably could have lived an okay life under the crown. You know, the Canadians did okay. But they didn't want to either. They wanted something better. They wanted to pursue and achieve happiness. In America, we admire the ambitious pursuit of success. The more obstacles a person overcomes in order to get to their success, the more we admire them, the more we even regard them as heroic. When you call that desire, the ambitious desire for happiness, when you call that just a desire for convenience, that's a kind of callous contempt for somebody's hopes and dreams. Now, there's an elephant in the room here, because you may be thinking, well, that's all well and good. I'm in favor of the pursuit of happiness as well. And if all we were talking about when we talked about abortion was aborting the growth of, let's say, a tumor, cancerous tumor inside of the woman, then there would be no objections, and we would admire her just as much as we admired, say, the cancer patient. It's true that the embryo is a special, distinctive stage in the human life cycle. We all started that way. The question is whether it's special and different enough for it to warrant the protection of individual rights, and the kind of individual rights that we've just been talking about. And so that gets us to the second big implication of the theory that I presented at the beginning. The first one was that it protects a positive achievement that we find morally admirable. And the second was that it protects it by protecting the individual's freedom of action in a social context. As I hope to have brought out with those examples from the Declaration and the Constitution, freedom here means freedom from the force of other people in society who would interfere. Interfere with what? Interfere with another member of society who's acting, interfering with their actions, which of course suggests that they are capable of acting. So of course it's true that the right to choose does not entail the right to violate someone else's rights. But what I'm going to argue, and you're probably starting to see the glimmers of it already, is that an embryo is not the kind of being protected by rights. It's not some member of society who acts. It's not an individual in the sense that matters. Yes, of course, an embryo is genetically human. It has human DNA. It doesn't have cat DNA or lizard DNA. Nobody disputes that, although anti-abortion people sometimes present it as though it's a revelation. But all that the DNA of a fertilized ovum tells us is that it has the potential to develop into an individual human being, not that it actually is one. Fun fact, only about 50% of fertilized ova ever make it to term. That's no certainty. And even if it were, it would still be a 100% potential, which is not yet an actual. Even unfertilized ova and sperm have the potential to become individual human beings if they are fertilized. Of course, that doesn't mean that they are actually individual human beings either. That doesn't even mean that they're actually fertilized. Just as an acorn is not an oak, a potential human being is not an actual human being. Now you may say, okay, fine, but isn't an embryo also individual? And it certainly is in certain respects. It's got a very unique shape, it's got a unique size, location, time of origin. Of course, so does everything on the planet that exists. The embryo even has, or might have, unique DNA. Of course, if it's an identical twin, it might not. Not all twins have identical DNA. So the various forms of uniqueness I just listed, these aren't the source of individual rights unless you think that an identical twin has no rights because it has the same DNA as its twin. Then the question becomes, okay, well then what kind of uniqueness, what kind of separateness, what kind of distinctness, what kind of individuation actually matters for having individual rights? And here we go back to what we discussed at the beginning when we talked about what individual rights actually are. The concept comes up because people live in society. They sometimes disagree with each other, and they need to be able to do that. They need to be able to disagree and disassociate on the basis of their disagreement if they're to live profitably in a society like that. And as I suggested already, what you're talking about there is people who are capable of acting and interacting with each other. You're talking about people who are physically and physiologically separate and therefore independent agents. It's only at that point when you are separable can your interaction cause interference that could possibly need some kind of protection by a concept like a right. In all of their writings about the importance of individual rights, John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, they didn't ever talk about the connection between their doctrine and the biochemistry of the being that had rights. What they talked about were the kinds of factors that I was just mentioning. Neither an embryo nor, I should say, a fetus is individual in this regard. It's not physically or physiologically distinct from the mother. It's instead physically attached to her and physiologically dependent on her. But this is especially obvious in the case of an embryo, where not only can it not act, it can't even move. It's basically like an implanted seed in the womb. And although critics of abortion will often disparage defenders of abortion rights for saying this, as though it betrays some kind of callousness, when you're talking about a very early stage embryo, you are really just talking about a clump of cells. Now, it's a special clump of cells that has the potential to develop into something like an organism, but it hasn't done that yet. And yet, it's this kind of clump, which does not act, which is what the largest number of women are being stopped from terminating because of these exhaustive bans on abortion. Let's remember one more thing, though, when it comes to considering how individual rights are about protecting the action of independent agents. If the embryo is not such an agent, guess who is? Guess who is quite obviously? Yes, obviously, a woman is an individual with respect to all the other members of society. She is a paradigm case of the kind of being that needs to be protected according to the doctrine of individual rights. If you say that an embryo has a right to life, this negates her rights. It means that she is now unfree to act toward it as she would toward a tumor. It means other people can now use force against her by forcing her to give birth. And that is what abortion laws do, by stopping her from pursuing happiness and even punishing her if she evades all of that. I think that the view that seriously considers that this 10-day-old blastocyst has a right that the woman must now defer to. This is not, if you really think that, it's not just an error in the application of the concept of individual rights. If you're really serious about that, and I don't know how many people actually are, I think it's pretty nihilistic. It's saying you should take an actual living, breathing, acting, thinking, feeling, hoping, dreaming individual and enslave her to a cellular metabolizer that doesn't do any of those other things. So why do people disagree? Well, there's a range of reasons, better and worse reasons. And I'll start with the better after I excuse myself from first mentioning this. Some people will say, well, it's just a perfectly logical syllogism. Human beings have rights, the embryo is human, therefore it has rights. Now, I hope to have shown already what's wrong with that argument and what kind of crude equivocation it involves, because the premise that says human beings have rights is talking about individual human beings who exist in a social context and interact with each other and make plans and pursue values and their happiness. The sense in which the embryo is human is not that sense at all. In fact, I don't think too many people actually adopt their abortion views because they read this syllogism in a book somewhere. It's not the argument that really motivates them to have the views. I think it's more like a after-the-fact rationalization that they pick up when they've read some philosophy texts. So what are the views that actually motivate people to be opposed to abortion rights? I'm going to talk about two that I think are more understandable, more innocent, still confused, and then I'll talk about two others that I think are less so. One is, somebody can very understandably think, okay, all that's great, but aren't there still some abortions that would be just wrong? And I would agree. I would say that if most late-term pregnancies that actually make it to late term would be wrong to end, if only because the woman should have decided a lot earlier that she didn't want the child, if only because she shouldn't have had to put herself through so much work of 8 months of carrying a burden just for something that she wasn't going to end up pursuing. If she really wanted to have a child, and then for some inexplicable reason in the last few weeks just capriciously decided to end it, throwing away her own dreams of motherhood, that would be really irrational and cowardly and wrong. I don't think there are many, if any, abortions that are actually like this in the late term. Most late-term abortions, and here I mean really late-term abortions, happen because of an immediate threat to the life of the woman, the health of the woman, or because of some severe fetal anomaly. But anyway, the whole worry rests on a confusion between questions of what is morally right and questions of what you have the right to do. Now, I have said that individual rights are there to protect something that is morally admirable. But that doesn't mean you can never have the right to do something that happens to be wrong. Because the way that rights protect what is the good is by protecting freedom. Freedom is what you need to identify your vision of the good. You need to be able to explore, you need to be able to go back and forth, you need to be able to make mistakes in order to actually figure out what's true. And so rights protect a morally positive thing by protecting the freedom it requires to pursue it. And this means you've got to have the right to be able to make mistakes. The idea of a right to do only what is right would not be any kind of freedom. So there's an understandable moral objection there that someone has to certain kinds of abortions, but ultimately this is not what we're talking about when we're talking about rights. Another confusion is that even, you could say, okay, fine, the embryo, the fetus, is not a actual individual human being with rights. It's a potential, but can't there still be value in a potential? And yes, I think there can be, if you are a parent who really wants to have a child. That potential is a real thing. It's a real embryo, a real fetus. And if you have always wanted to have a child, it's of value to you to protect it. But needless to say, that's only if you want it. It's not of value to a woman who doesn't want it. It's not of value really to anyone else at that point. Nobody else knows about it. It's not even of value to itself. It doesn't have the cognitive equipment to value things, let alone its own life. So yes, here again, we have a legitimate point. Potentials can be valuable, but this doesn't mean that they are valuable to the woman. And even if it were valuable to the woman, as we said from the previous point, she still has the right to make a mistake. So I think those two sources of confusion about abortion rights that actually motivate people to oppose them, they can come from better places. The next two I'm not so sure about. And these will be the last two. One idea is that if we don't say that the embryo has rights from conception, there won't be a principled way to decide when any other subsequent human being does have rights. You won't be able even to explain what's wrong with infanticide. Here's why they think this. They point out, well, where else could we draw the line? We could draw it at the point of viability. Now, the Supreme Court had, I think, actually pretty good criticisms of the viability standard in its recent Dobbs v. Jackson decision. It's a pretty fuzzy line, seemingly arbitrary. It depends a lot on what the current state of medical technology is. It depends on someone's proximity to a hospital. There's no easy way to figure out what is the age of viability. Okay. But then this view will also say, yes, but the line of birth is also arbitrary. Why do they think that? Well, if you have a fetus that's in the uterus 1 minute, and then the next minute it's out, there's no important differences between the fetus at either point. It's just a difference in geography, is what this objection will say. And so they'll say, since viability is arbitrary, since birth is arbitrary, the only way to draw a firm, bright line where we can say this is where rights begin is at conception. If you're legitimately worried about the possibility of infanticide, I can see that as a legitimate reason, but whether conception is the only alternative is the problem. I think that the view of individual rights that I've explained so far does a pretty good job explaining why birth really is a bright line. It gives you a principle. It's only at birth that you are individuated from your mother in the relevant ways, physically, physiologically separated. It's only then when you become able to be an independent actor. It's only then when you are no longer an inescapable burden on your mother. When she was pregnant, there was a necessary drag on her health that she could not avoid as long as she had that pregnancy unless she decided to end it. Once born, the child can be adopted by anyone who can care for it. There's no longer a conflict between her and it. Because of that physical separation that occurs at birth, there are also enormous physiological changes that happen at birth. It's just not true to say that it's a mere change in geography. There's a really excellent article in the May 2014 Medical Law Review by a legal theorist named Achis Burin, who describes the changes physiologically that happen at birth. And I'm just going to read a paragraph here because I think it's eye-opening. She writes, and each one of these sentences is footnoted to a medical journal. With hormonal support, the lungs inflate, circulation is redirected, and the digestive system becomes active. There are also profound changes in hormonal function, metabolism, and temperature regulation. The lungs are emptied of fetal fluid and lubricants secreted to facilitate expansion so breathing can begin. In the absence of abnormality, both very preterm and term infants will begin breathing without intervention. The volume of blood pumped from the heart nearly doubles. There are also major structural changes to the circulatory system. Before birth, oxygen is supplied by the placenta, so blood flows from the right to the left atrium of the heart without passing the lungs. Following birth, the ducts that enabled this to happen close permanently. Byrne also points out, at birth, we start crying, which is how we begin to communicate with our parents. At birth, we're exposed to light and gravity, which engenders in us a new period of mental activity. We're suddenly able to perceive a world of entities in which we can begin to act and with which we can begin to interact. We can begin to form concepts. This is what brings us to the human level of cognition as opposed to the pre-animal sub-sensory level that's we're at best capable of in the womb. The difference between life in utero and ex utero is almost literally the difference between night and day. Now, you can ask pedantic questions about at precisely what moment a child counts as born. What's the magic moment, is what this objection will often say. And it's true that there are no magic lines that are drawn for us by God or nature. Life gradually fades into and out of existence from other living beings. It's we human beings who have to do the line drawing. We have to draw the lines according to the biggest differences that we can find in order to capture and bring out the biggest and most important similarities. And I think that birth is the biggest difference that you can find that's relevant for a political philosophy that enshrines individual rights. What's the alternative? If it's supposed to be conception, that, by comparison, is an opaque and blurry line. It's opaque because even the woman doesn't know right away when she's pregnant. And it's blurry, a lot blurrier than its advocates would accept, because it actually takes 24 to 48 hours for all of the genetic material to merge in the process of fertilization. Where's the magic point in that timeline? It could also still twin, which means you could have two distinct individuals. And even the genetic code is not sufficient to determine the kind of organism that it's eventually going to be given birth to, which is something we're increasingly being able to appreciate because of the field of epigenetics. Genetics is not all that goes into an organism. So they've been asking for this magic moment. There isn't one. There's not one in their view either. But it is interesting and I think revealing that they put it in terms of magic, that they want there to be a magic moment. And that gets me to the last point. The last, what I think is the major source of, if not confusion, then error about abortion rights. The major reason, I think, that people latch on to the idea of a right to life that an embryo can have, the actual worldview that endorses something like magic, a supernatural worldview, the religious worldview. And if you think about the nature of opposition to abortion in this country, it sure does explain a lot to think of it as really ultimately coming from a religious worldview. It explains the idea that these are just abortions of convenience, that there's something pridefully arrogant about pursuing our happiness. It explains the antipathy to sexual joy that usually comes along with opposition to abortion. It explains the hope that there should be a magic moment when rights begin. And it explains the idea that there could be a right for an entity that's so far removed from the ordinary conditions in which members of society have rights. It's really important to emphasize just how ultimately incompatible a religious worldview is with the philosophy of individual rights. I've said repeatedly now that the concept of individual rights is something that comes out of the Enlightenment. This is, of course, a period in which scientific reasoning is becoming dominant, in which the religious traditions of the past are being rejected. And if you go to the religious thinkers who more than anything else defined the preceding period, the Dark and the Middle Ages, you can see just how different their worldview is from one that actually endorses individual rights. St. Augustine, the major church father justified the institution of slavery as a punishment for man's sinful nature. Even Aquinas, late medieval thinkers, much more enlightened than Augustine, justified slavery on other grounds as well. Both of them justified one kind of right, the divine right of kings, which was the main kind of right that anyone cared about in this period. What of private rights? Well, St. Ambrose thought that God gave mankind the earth to have and share in common. Private property was just an aberration that was the product of avaricious greed. Feudal lords would sometimes bestow rights on cities and guilds, but there was no talk of individual rights. After all, in this worldview, mankind under the dominion of the Pope and the Emperor was often portrayed as being in a kind of mystical union with the body of Christ. That's not individualism, that's its opposite. Now, there is a certain religious conception of rights, one that I think the contemporary opposition to abortion rights usually draws on when it speaks of the right to life and other such rights. In late medieval thinking, the term rights and its equivalents ends up coming up in the work of thinkers like Occam and Suarez and Grotius. But it's this view that I mentioned previously where all that it really is a shadow of a duty. You've got a duty to not kill, and therefore somebody has a right to not be killed. But it's no protection of some kind of positive, virtuous action. There's no room for this view of the positive, virtuous action of the individual in this whole period. That view of rights in late Christian thinking is, I think, more or less putting old religious wine in new terminological skins. They're still working with the conception of religious duty that's imposed by some kind of divine commander. And if you think about it, it's one last example of just how different it is from the Enlightenment conception of individual rights, is that the advocates of the opponents of abortion rights are very, very different from a movement they often try to compare themselves to. They often try to compare themselves to the abolitionist movement, which really was a product of the Enlightenment and the view of individual rights. What's happening in the abolitionist movement is people are starting to realize, look, these people who are enslaved, they're actually rational beings like us. We didn't realize it, but now we know that we were wrong. We empathize with their plight because they're like us. Can you really empathize with an embryo? Can you really put yourself in its position and feel the injustice that it's being subjected to by abortion? I don't think you can. I don't think that's psychologically realistic. What I do think is psychologically realistic is to believe, as I think many opponents of abortion do, that God imposes duties on us, including a duty of self-sacrifice, which the woman must engage in. And speaking of the right of the fetus to life, I think is really just, at the end of the day, an excuse to emphasize why we think she should sacrifice. Trouble, of course, is that all of this magical thinking has no place in a scientific worldview. It has no place in the public policy of a secular society. And I think we should reject it. So I'd like to close now by returning to reality from the world of magic we were just discussing. And I want to show you the reality of this is Emily, who I began by talking about. She's a real live person portrayed on page 103 of this book, Shout Your Abortion, by Amelia Bono and Emily Noakes, no relation to the editor. And I want to close just by reading a paragraph from Emily's account of why she decided to have this abortion. I already shared the part about how she didn't want just the okay life, but she says more. She says, having an abortion reminded me that I was the one in control of my life, that despite the powerlessness I had felt for the last year and a half, I did have power. I could determine the direction of my life. I stood a little taller and walked with more conviction. I was doing something for myself. I was making a decision that was good for me. I think that's the most American kind of attitude that a man or a woman can have. It's the same kind of attitude we admire in the American revolutionaries who fought the king. It's the attitude we admire in business heroes who pursue their happiness, creating new values in the world. It's the attitude we admire in cancer patients working to save their own lives against that tumor. I think we need to see the woman deciding to have an ordinary abortion in the same kind of light as someone who's taking control of her reproductive life for the sake of pursuing her own vision of happiness. I think we need to brush aside the idea that that pursuit of hers should be restrained by fetal rights in just the same way that the Founding Fathers brushed aside the idea of the divine right of kings. She's pursuing her happiness. It's her right to do it. She could have lived an okay life, but she didn't want to. Thank you. All right, we have a mic up here for questions. This is just so that it will go onto the live stream recording. So who'd like to go?
I've done quite a few Emily's, and I really like that as an example. And it's interesting too because in that situation, it also affects the father, even though abortion is primarily a female right. But, you know, to bring an unwanted child into the world would also affect the father. I don't know if you've thought about father's rights in this scenario.
I've thought a little bit about it as a man. Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a really good book that I would actually recommend in connection with this, which I happen to have right here with me. It's called Scarlet A by Katie Watts in the Ethics, Law, and Politics of Ordinary Abortion. She's got a section in here about all of the ways in which men benefit rightly from abortion. And I mean, that's sometimes used by abortion opponents as evidence of its impurity. But it's part of the reason why I care about this issue as a man. I mean, and I think more men should. That, you know, if our partner gets pregnant, it obviously is going to affect us. If we're responsible, we're going to want to help her. But we might not be able to afford it any more than she can. I think there are a lot of men who are succeeding and prospering today because their partner had an abortion. They may or may not know it. Too often, women don't tell. I think more of them should. And I think more men should support their partner's decision. There's an anecdote. Let's see if I can find it. There's an anecdote in here about how one of the authors that's quoted at least says, too often when men find out that their partner's pregnant, they say, "I'll support whatever decision you make," and they think that they're being respectful in saying that. And there's an element in which they are, I think. But the author said, some of these women might need to hear, "I'll support it if you have an abortion," thinking that that it's just a value-neutral question for the husband, which it isn't for him or for her.
Ben, I think that was a really well-reasoned defense of abortion rights. But I'd like to focus on other proponents of abortion rights and some of their arguments.
Sure.
In particular, Some people will use this argument perhaps as a one of their tactics. They'll say that the opponents of abortion rights are straight white men, and therefore, like, their arguments are not valid. So, like, I guess, what are your thoughts on that? And can you perhaps give some broad opinions of the arguments for abortion rights overall that maybe you might have something to say about?
Yeah, a few things. I mean, it might be true that historically all the great opponents of abortion rights were were old white men, but that's because old white men were doing most everything for a long time until recently. So that's an accident. I also think it's just, if the implication of that criticism is that what causes opposition to abortion rights is sexism, then, I mean, I think there might be an element of truth to that, but I also think it's a relatively superficial element. The major element is what I said at the end of the talk. It's a religious philosophic outlook that takes a kind of principled stand against this right, because the idea is you don't own your own life. You're the creation of God. God owns your life. He's the one who gets to decide what to do with it. He's the one who gets to be the Lord of life and death. You don't get to assume that kind of power on your own, you prideful sinner. And I think a lot of people take that view seriously in one form or other. I mean, there are atheists who are against abortion rights, but I think at the end of the day, it's usually because they've picked up this kind of religious view of rights, that rights are things that are just correlatives of duties. The duties are contextless, don't relate in any way to a human being's pursuit of happiness. They may have picked it up inadvertently, but they did anyway. So, I mean, I think there are philosophic reasons that people oppose abortion rights. Yeah, I think there's probably misogyny in there too. I think it's probably less pronounced than it used to be. I mean, there's a lot of women who are opposed to abortion rights. And that's not to say women can't be sexist, because they can be. But I think in most cases, what's driving them is their philosophic outlook. And then one last thing about that, which is, I think that view often goes along with seeing abortion rights as a women's issue, as an issue that matters to women in virtue of their membership in this collective class. And I think that's a dead wrong way to think about this issue, in large part because I think it's an issue of individual rights, not anything collectivist. And also because of the thing that I mentioned in response to Christy's question, which is this is a men's issue too.
So this is just a request to fill in some missing terms in the history, or some bits of history you lighted over. You talked about the religious conception of rights of thinkers in the later Middle Ages. You put even Grotius in that category, and talked about the language of rights as just being old wine in new bottles. But of course, Locke is religious, speaks about God, brings up God in the context of talking about rights. Some of the American founders did as well. So if you're not seeing that as the same old wine in new bottles, it's the dividing point isn't whether God is mentioned or connected to rights.
That's exactly right.
Something else. So what is it? What's new? Where does the dividing line happen? Is it with Locke or with someone prior? And what do you see as the sea change?
Yeah. So this is an excellent question. It's one that I did a lot of research on just for this talk, as it happens. And yeah, so Locke's a Christian, or some kind of religious deist, at least. At least he says he is. The Straussians think maybe he's... Yes, Straussians think it's just to escape the censors. I don't think they're... I don't think they're right. But I do think that there's still an important shift that happens in Locke's thought. And it's because of the fact that even though he officially grants many of the same premises that the previous thinkers grant, there's a way in which he's trying to graft onto Christian premises new ideas that you can maybe reconcile with the Christian premises if you try, but it requires reconciliation. And the most obvious of these is the idea of self-ownership. He makes a big deal in the Second Treatise on Government when talking about property rights, about self-ownership. And when he talks about property rights, he doesn't just mean physical property. He says, by property, I mean lives, liberties, possessions. And about that, he says, man has self-ownership. He owns himself, and therefore he owns his labor, and this is why he's able to take out of the common and make what is his. And I mean, there's other places in his work where he also says God owns man because God created him. And then there's all this scholarly debate about how do you reconcile those two. And different thinkers have different proposals for how to reconcile them. But like you have to do the reconciliation, and it at least presents a problem. And it's something that nobody really said before. There's certain language in certain of these later Christian thinkers about self-mastery, but it's very different from what Locke means by it. What they usually mean is self-mastery for the purpose of being an ascetic, of being able to forego pleasures. And there's nothing like that in Locke at all. He's very much on the premise of self-preservation and happiness matter. He thinks that the earth is given to man, to the industrious and the rational. If you look at the way he himself he was an advocate of the right to revolution, which is that same kind of act of political self-esteem that, of course, later gets picked up by Locke. There's a couple of good sources to look at to see what's so distinctive about Locke. One is this really excellent history that I found called Philosophical History of Rights by Gary Herbert. And then there's a more contemporary scholar whose name is S. Adam Seagrave, who's written a bunch of later interpretive work on Locke, explaining what he thinks is distinctive about Locke, explaining why it's really with him that you first get a robust concept of individual rights that you don't have in any of these previous thinkers. And he often talks about the previous thinkers and explains these differences.
So you talked a lot about how religion is motivating the opposition to abortion. Do you have any optimism or tactical thoughts around whether that can be changed at all? Or is it basically that we've all changed, we picked our sides? We have the rational, basically rational, and then we have the religious side, and you just choose one, and that's what you go with? I mean, can a religious person be talked out of magical thinking around embryos or not?
It's a really good question. I hope so. I mean, I think there are people who are nominally religious. I'm sure there are some in this room who, at the same time, don't think of themselves as opposed to abortion rights. But I think there it's important that they're nominally religious. They believe in a deity. They think it has something to do with morality. But at the same time, they're pretty American in their outlook. That is, they think life is about the pursuit of happiness, and they go to church on Sundays, but the other 6 days of the week, they're living the American dream. And so, I mean, the best you can hope for is that people start to just compartmentalize their religion and segregate it from their thinking about ethics and politics and public policy. And I mean, one thing you can do, just practically speaking, when talking with people about something like this is, okay, you believe in God, you believe in this entity, in this deity, but I don't, and so why should your beliefs govern our society and govern people who don't believe? And I think a lot of people don't have a good answer to that question, and are then content to say, okay, this is just my private belief that I'll keep to myself. I'm not going to try to impose it on other people. I think you can make a lot of mileage with that.
It strikes me that most of or a lot of the debate around abortion is actually just emotional. You have the picture is not an argument. You see, destroyed fetuses, and they use that as an argument for why it's evil. And then on the other hand, you have people who are sort of well-meaning, but they can't imagine ever ending an embryo's life because they're projecting forward. They're imagining an actual child, and they just can't imagine ever committing an abortion. But that's not really an argument. Why do you think people are so emotional about this issue?
I don't think it's possible to not be emotional on this issue. I mean, I get emotional about this issue, and I'm not even a woman. So it's an issue that connects deeply and centrally to people's basic value premises and worldview. And anytime you see that cluster of beliefs being threatened, either because your own life is being threatened or because your worldview is being threatened, I mean, it's gonna be emotionally charged. It's gonna be perceived as this is a threat to something about your self-esteem. So I don't think there's a way to make it an unemotional topic. I think you need to be rational. Like, you need to give rational arguments. That's what I've been trying to do. But you have to do it with a view to what you regard as valuable in life. And so you're going to end up making passionately logical arguments. The passionate search for dispassionate truth is the phrase I always remember. Yes.
That was a very good breakdown of individual rights. Thank you. My question is around future legislation. So there was this one birth of a lamb which happened outside of the lamb's womb, right? It was an embryonic.
Artificial womb.
Yeah, it was an artificial womb. So as technology is headed towards artificial wombs in the future, how do you see the legislation changing? And the woman's right adapting when artificial wombs are an option and the fetus could be removed out of the woman.
Yeah. I definitely think there are going to be some new considerations there that the law is going to have to think about and deal with and define. But at the end of the day, I don't think it's something so devastatingly new that it changes anything I've said. I think all the same principles still apply to it, because it's true, of course, that if you have something being born from an artificial womb, it's not in anyone's body. And so that at least presents the fact that there's no conflict with a woman that we're talking about anymore. But it's also true that it's still not an individual in the sense that it's able to live independently as an independent entity. It's still depending on that apparatus. And so that's going to have implications.
So the point when you were saying the birth is the significant point of change between an individual and where the woman's rights. And in this case, the removal of the embryo would be that change, right? So the question is, would the government be able to force a woman to have that removal process done?
From that artificial womb apparatus?
No, from her into the artificial womb.
Oh, I see. So you're saying if you could take it out and put it in an artificial womb so that she didn't have to kill it, but this way she wouldn't have to give birth to it, would that solve the problem? No, I don't think so. Because the removal process is still an intrusion into her body that she has to be able to control. I sometimes make the point that, like, if you had a Star Trek style matter-antimatter transporter where you could just beam the fetus out of a woman's body and put it somewhere else, maybe then we could have a conversation about how things would change. But that's not anything like what we have or will have anytime soon. It's still going to involve some kind of invasive procedure or surgery, and that's still a strain and stress on her body that she may want to avoid, and that abortion may be easier than that. Any other comments or criticisms? Hoping that we could at least get a critic.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed that talk. I was curious, though. I find that a lot of kind of people that are pro-abortion rights are arguing from the standpoint of like edge cases, like you brought up, which is why I enjoyed your arguments so much. So typically they use these kind of stories and that kind of bring up a lot of empathy, but I find a lot of people kind of steer away or maybe haven't even thought of the more like philosophical argument of individual rights. So do you think this kind of undermines the argument of basically abortion rights? The fact that so many people are arguing from that standpoint and not from kind of where you're coming from.
I wouldn't say it undermines it,
Yeah.
but I would say it's not doing it a lot of good, because it's then very reactive. It's like you say, taking edge cases that, yes, generate a lot of emotion, but which don't really get to the principle at stake, and because they don't apply to most of the abortions that actually happen. I think, there are so few defenders of abortion rights who even talk about rights anymore. They talk about healthcare access, and abortion is healthcare, and they wonder why they're losing their battle. They're losing their battle because they don't take the moral high ground. And I think the reason that they don't take the moral high ground, sad to say, but at the end of the day, I think fundamentally they're not, most of them at least, are not really in disagreement with the kind of religious morality that their opponents have. And that's because in the West, there's not really been a major alternative to religious morality that's ever been offered. There's been attempts to secularize the same view of self-sacrifice that religion stands for, but there's never, I think with the major exception of Ayn Rand, been someone who's challenged that view head on and said, no, there's nothing morally virtuous about sacrifice. There is something morally virtuous about pursuing your happiness. And I think until more abortion advocates start to embrace that kind of message, I think they're sadly going to keep losing.
Thanks.
I think you maybe just commented on what I'm going to say, but, and I don't have any numbers to back this, but I think an awful lot of the opponents to abortion are people who have a lot of duty in their own lives, and they have not made choices for their own happiness because they feel obligated to live by duty. So they want to impose that on other people. And you're certainly not going to change their minds about some college student or young woman with a career or a young couple, like this is the wrong time for us to have children. You're not going to interest them in that because their whole lives have been full of sacrifice. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I think you're probably right. It's hard to quantify it. It's hard to prove it in any given person's case that something like that is motivating them. But if I just go by like my own internal psychology and the way I used to feel when I was religious, which I was, and I was opposed to abortion, and I changed my mind about a lot. But and when I was serious about that kind of moral outlook, I think there's definitely a real phenomenon where, like I was a good little boy, and I followed all the rules, and I didn't have the courage to break with these rules and do what I wanted to. And why don't more people do what I did? And how dare they think that they're better than me? I did what I was supposed to do. So that's a real. I think that's a real psychology. I think there are probably a lot of people who had the child they were supposed to have because they felt pressured not to abort it. And this isn't just abortion that people have this attitude about. Yeah.
Hi. So I have a question about kind of your opinion on the state of abortion rights advocacy. So if you think that they start with the same religious worldview, like where do you think that they went differently from the religious people to end up at such a different place?
People who advocate for abortion rights today?
Correct, yes.
Well, it could be lots of different things. I mean, it could in part be something I mentioned earlier, that people have just a kind of nominal appreciation for religion and with that a nominal appreciation for the morality that comes with it. There's that. There's if for example they approach abortion rights in the way I was just portraying a moment ago, as it's a women's issue and not an issue of individual rights. I think that kind of gender collectivism is very prominent in our culture today, and it still has that moral view. It just thinks that there are different objects of sacrifice. We're not so concerned with sacrificing ourselves for the sake of God. We are, however, for the sake of our sex. And our sex is the cause there that we need to subordinate ourselves. So that morality is still there. It's just operative in a different form. But I think there's also just some better ones. There's not enough of them, I think, who maybe never were religious, who never took it seriously, and know that they only have one life to live. So I would like very much to reach out to them.
Hey, Dr. Barry, thank you for the talk. Given the important role that technology plays in our life and, the ever-changing nature of it, if at a certain point in the future, we were able to tell at what point consciousness emerged in a fetus, would you then assign the individual rights of a normal human to the fetus at that point, or is there still something else that fundamentally distinguishes the two?
I think it's something else. We already know that at least late-term fetuses have a lot of, if not all of, the neurological capacity that they need to feel pain. And this is usually offered as the basis for so-called fetal pain laws that would outlaw abortion at the point where they reach that capacity. I don't know if the fact they have that capacity means they actually feel it. There's some reasons to think they might not. There's even more reason to think that even if they could feel it, wouldn't really matter to them, because if you don't have any self-consciousness, whatever consciousness of pain you have doesn't make a difference to you that much. If you've ever undergone certain medical procedures where you feel it happening but you don't care, this is a real thing. But the broader point is that rights don't just come from having some kind of consciousness. I would say they don't even come from having the distinctively human kind of consciousness, which is rational consciousness, which is ability to form concepts and envision cause and effect and act on it and manipulate the world on the basis of it. It's the fact that we have that form of consciousness and that we use it to survive, and that we need to use it to survive, and that our minds need to be free in order to use it. And that goes all along with everything I was talking about today, about being an independent actor in the world. Like if there was some rational Martian that came down from Earth, but didn't use its rationality to live, it used some other instinct or something, I don't see why we would say it had rights. You'd have to make a special case for that.
Thank you.
I have another kind of historical question, and I guess this will be the last. You talked a lot about the opposition to abortion rights coming from religion. And I think at a deep level that's right. But there's also the fact that the particular religious taboo on abortion, as separate from taboos on birth control and as a particular issue, is kind of a historical latecomer, right? It wasn't the case that the religious were always against abortion equally at different times. So is there something to say about how this issue arose, particularly with the Catholic issue before it was a Protestant one? How were religious thinkers in history thinking of abortion? I'm sure they weren't too excited about it, but they didn't seem to have viewed it as a special crime, different from, having a good time or just having sex in the first place. When did this particular religious animus against this act come about?
Yeah, good. So there's several things to say here. One is that even the Catholic Church wasn't always opposed to abortion from the point of conception. That's a relatively recent development, I think, in the late 19th century. Up until that point, it had been the moment of quickening when the fetus starts to kick, that had been perceived, that's when life begins, and that's when it counts as murder. Now, even before that, the Catholics still thought it was wrong to end the pregnancy. They just didn't think it was murder. So there you just have basically the development of embryology and modern biology that kind of they plug their pre-existing view into. So that's one change. But then it's also true that it was largely a Catholic issue for much of the 19th and 20th century. And it wasn't a Protestant issue. Sometimes Protestants would even pride themselves on being different from Catholics, like in that Monty Python sketch. And there, I'm less sure about what explains the religious coalescence around this issue, because I think the Protestants started to follow the lead of the Catholics, especially around the time of the 70s and the 80s and the growth of the moral majority and the Reagan administration. And I mean, I think to this day, Catholics have the most worked out, consistent, philosophical, intellectual views on this question. Protestants somewhat less so. I think they're following, and I think it's often for less intellectual reasons. I think there's a real component of just plain political tribalism, that the other side has embraced this doctrine of abortion rights. We hate the other side. Let's find reasons to hate them and criticize them. And oh, the Catholics found one. Let's go with that. That's not a fully worked out view on my part, but I think but that's my suspicion. It's a heavily tribalistic football at this point in American politics, which is a sign of how bad things have gotten in American politics. Oh, one more.
Speaking of American politics, what do you think will happen with the outright ban on abortion in Texas?
I wish I knew. I don't see much hope for its being overturned substantially anytime soon. This story that I mentioned at the top of the talk about Amanda Zorowski and the suit she filed against the state, I think she'll probably make some headway with it, but she's not asking for an overturn of the law. She's just asking for better defined exceptions. And the defenders of the current law will say, in fact, well, there already is an exception for the life and health of the mother. These doctors were being too stingy in giving out these exceptions. I think they're right to be afraid. The doctors are right to be afraid. They don't know what to expect from this law or this governor, and they've certainly been cowed into submission by it. So I think there will probably be some legislation to better define the exceptions. It'll be very concrete bound. It'll be in an XYZ kind of case. You can, when you are septic because you had the same kind of problem with her cervix that she had, they'll make a long list, and it'll be very concrete bound, and it'll leave some breathing room for pregnant women who want to have a child. But I don't see it changing much more anytime soon. We know that in some states that when it's put to a vote, like in Kansas, even in red states, the Republican voters will vote to overturn these exhaustive abortion bans, which I think is a good sign for Republican voters. But unfortunately, now that that's happened, I think there's going to be a lot less incentive for anyone to want to put it to a vote. And there have already been a few, I think, Democratic state representatives in Texas who've tried to push forward a bill to have a referendum, and it won't get out of committee, I don't think, because in Texas it has to get through the legislature before there's a vote on it. And so the only hope for change in Texas is if the Democrats start to win local state elections, and they're a real mixed bunch who I'd like to see them win on this, but not on everything. So it would be nice if there were some Republicans perhaps, in our midst who could start to realize this is not a winning issue with voters. Because in fact, it's not. Like when they do polls of the people of Texas and ask them, do you think that Roe v. Wade should be overturned and abortion should be banned from birth? And the majority of Texans do not support that at all. They support very limited abortion rights. They don't want to have it like New York, but they also don't want this overwhelming ban. So if there are Democratic politicians who can make better use of that, if there are maybe some Republican politicians, maybe in swing districts in the suburbs, who will start to realize when they see more cases like Amanda Zarowski's, this is not a winning issue. Maybe they will start to change, but I'm not too optimistic for the near-term future, unfortunately. And I'm more worried about like what's going to happen with this medication abortion case that I mentioned. The hope that we have there is that the judge that they're going before in Amarillo, Merchek or something, I can't remember his last name. He's a Trump appointee, and he's known to be critical of abortion rights. And so there's a good chance that he might actually side with the plaintiffs and render this injunction. Now, that's his district. It would apply to the whole country, but if someone else brings another case in a different district, which they're doing in, I think, Oregon, then you'll have a split circuit. And when you have a split circuit, it typically goes to the Supreme Court. And then the question is, what's the Supreme Court going to do? Well, in the Dobbs decision, they were very insistent that states should be able to choose these policies, that there shouldn't be a blanket federal policy. We know that they're not happy with abortion rights, but maybe that kind of federalist reasoning would lead them to stop the injunction and decide with the other circuit. Same time, there's this Comstock Act, which actually forbids the sending of abortion medication through the mail, and it's still on the books, in federal law. So somebody should remove that. I don't know what else to say. Maybe somebody here will have a way to do it. All right. I think that's it. Thanks, everybody. One more. Oh, one more? I'll take two applause.
What is the best indicator of someone being pro-abortion? Is it their religion? Is it being Republican? Is it being uneducated? Is it being surrounded by people who vote anti-abortion? Do you know any studies around that?
What are indications that they're being anti-abortion?
Yeah.
There probably are studies, but I am sadly just not aware of what they say. I'm just going to plead ignorance on that one.
Okay, I'll research later.
Thanks.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Ben. I'd like to ask everybody to join me in thanking our speaker, Ben Bayer, and all of our questioners and all of our viewers online. We'll be back here next week at our regular podcast time for an episode of Choose Your Issues, and we hope to see some of you in person online then. And until then, good night and good premises.